Hi, do you work here?
Sure do.
Yeah, I got a question about this 556 brass versus this 223 brass. If I load this 556 brass for my 223, will that work?
That's so unsafe, it could even blow your face off.
What the fuck? Old Man Taylor coming to you from the reloading bench. Today's topic, the actual process of loading these cases, and I'm going to take you through it from the very beginning, from a spent cartridge all the way to a completed cartridge. And I'm going to throw in a couple caveats. One, I'm going to cover 223/556 specifically, the little things that are different about it, the little nuances that are involved in that. And number two is I'm going to show you exactly how I loaded the rounds that you saw in the last video, the 223 powder selection. Some of you were very impressed with the size of those groups. I'm going to show you what I did to get that result. Well, these cases that I'm loading now are going to be the cartridges I'm going to use in the next video, what we're going to do with that data. I decided to break this into its own video, and I was going to just drop segments of this in the series as we went. But what I decided to do, because YouTube is a little bit finicky when it comes to hand load videos and showing this process. A few years ago, they would not have allowed this video to be available. Today, they've lightened up a little bit and we can get this content out. So I'm going to get it out to you, but I don't know what they're going to do tomorrow. So I didn't want to include this content in the other videos when we're talking about the process of load development, just in case they change their mind, which they probably will. If we lose this video, it'll just be gone and it won't affect the other videos. I'm going to set up the reloading bench, get my equipment ready to go, and I will meet you at the bench running our very first stage of the loading process. Let's talk about case prep in 223. And when I use the term 223, might as well throw a /5.56 on the end of that. This is all going to be the same process for the hand loader. Our brass is sometimes said to be thicker in 556 than 223. That's really kind of just a rule of thumb for some manufacturers. My testing has shown that I've found some 556 that has thinner brass than some of the more quality 223 brass. So it's really brand specific rather than 556 versus 223. So I'm going to say 223, and we're going to treat this all the same. If you do have some 556 range pickups, and it's true 556, it's got the plus with the circle around it, that means it's NATO 556. One of the NATO specs is that it's going to have a crimp in the primer pocket, and we're going to have to deal with that crimp. But some 223 cases also have a primer crimp. So I need to check for that either way, and that's usually just a ring of material inside there. It looks like somebody put a sleeve inside the primer pocket, because that's exactly what they did. In other calibers, it may be different, maybe stamps where they're pushing it in and some other things. But in 556, 223, that's the most common, quote, crimp that we see. And we've got to cut that out. I'm going to do that with my drill, and I'm going to use a bit that will cut that. And I'll leave a link to that in the description if you want to pick one of those up. They're very inexpensive. Definitely recommend the drill. Definitely recommend mounting it in a vise. You can just sit there and pop them in and out, take that right off. But in this case, I'm going to be using high quality brass. I'm going to be using Lapua as normal. Really good stuff. Doesn't require any primer pocket work at all. Could I uniform my pockets? I could. There's really no point. There's no need to. This is fired brass, and I recommend for load development purposes that you have 3 firings on your brass to make sure it's fully sized to your chamber. It's not going to grow anymore. In 223, very high pressure at small volume, that tends to happen on our second firing. So if I've got some 2 times fired, I'm probably safe to start load development. If you want to be completely sure, go ahead and use 3 times fired brass. Now, one thing to note, and I won't get into the debate about annealing here, I'm not annealing at all for my application and what we're doing here. If I was bench shooting and I'm trying to shoot the smallest possible groups that I can, and the difference between X's and 10s matter, I probably would be annealing. But I'm not looking for that extreme level of precision. I'm not going to be shooting it out of a rifle that way. I'm not going to be shooting that style. I'm going to try to shoot the smallest groups I can with my rifle. And in my experience, any benefit from annealing is lost on the level of accuracy of my rifle, half MOA. Once I get smaller than that, there's a lot of luck going on, and if I shoot a large enough group, it's probably going to be that size or bigger. Annealing's really not necessary if that's the range of your system. If you've got a very expensive system and you're shooting extreme precision, by all means anneal. If you're doing it for precision and you don't have that set up, in my opinion, it's a waste of time, effort, and money. Will it make your brass last longer? In 223, it might. It won't help my primer pockets at all. So if my primer pockets get loose and I lose my brass because of that, annealing won't make any difference whatsoever. If, however, I split my necks, and when I see my cases failing, it's because of split necks, just recognize that annealing would stop that or slow it down to the point where my primer pockets probably will be my issue. Keep that in mind. 223 is a little more sensitive to neck failure than primers failing generally, unless I'm loading really, really hot loads. For brass prep, the next step for this is I'm just going to clean the brass. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that either, and we'll see why when I go to trim. I've got to remove my lube. I'm going to go ahead and clean them up a little bit while I've got it on the drill and spinning. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time even cleaning. I'm going to use a dry tumble, very easy, throw it in the hopper, turn it on, leave it overnight. In the morning, dump it out, and that's what I've got here. So once I've done that, I'm going to move on to my decap. I'm going to use it in my setup today, and you don't have to do it this way, but if you're going to try to replicate what I'm doing, this is what I'm doing. I'm using a universal decap pin first, and I'm removing my primer pockets on this press. Now, could you do all of this on one press? Absolutely. I just happen to have two, and they're sitting here, so I'm going to go back and forth. But what I'm going to do is after they're decapped, then I'm going to lube my cases. Then I'm going to take them and I'm going to size them. But I'm only going to do an outsize, full size resize. And I'm going to bump my shoulder back, and we'll go over that while I do that. Once I'm done with that, my neck diameter won't be set, my quote neck tension. It'll be too far. So then I'm going to use a mandrel to open up my neck again to the exact dimension that I want, so that it'll hold my projectile exactly as tight as I want to do. So I'm going to break up full-size resizing into 3 steps: to decapping, to running it through a sizing die with the decap rod and the expanding ball removed. And I can use a bushing or not, really not a big difference there. And then I'm going to set the neck tension with the mandrel, and that's why there's not a big difference with whether or not I use a bushing. Run out may be an issue there. If it is for you, then use the bushing setup. All right, let's do it. Talk about lubrication for just a minute. Not a big difference here with 223 than other calibers, but there is a little bit of a difference. Because the diameter of this case is so small, if I'm going to get a case stuck sizing, it's probably going to be 223. So lube becomes really important. The challenge is if I don't get enough lube, I'm going to get a case stuck in my sizing die. If I use too much lube, I'm going to get a dent inside my shoulder here. Now, that'll be okay. I'll be able to shoot it and it'll come out fine in the end. I won't ruin the brass. But if I'm doing load development, I'd prefer that they all be exactly the same, so I don't want any dimples. So how do I handle that? Well, I'm going to use my home brew. This is lanolin and alcohol, and this particular brew is 10 parts alcohol to 1 part lanolin. So I'm just going to put that in my container, and I'm going to give that a little bit of a shake, and I'm going to mute the sound here. And that should be lubed perfectly. Now, one of the challenges we have if we're using a spray lubrication is that we have a lot of alcohol that is actually the carrier for the lube. And in that case, the alcohol itself is not a very good lubricant. So I need to do what's called off-gassing, and this is if I use one shot or any type of spray lubricant. I've got to do the same thing. I've got to give that alcohol a chance to evaporate off there and leave just the lube, or I'm really likely to get one of these cases stuck in there and I can feel that alcohol on my fingers. So just let that sit, maybe 10-15 minutes, and then run it through your sizing die. Don't rush that. Let that off gas, or you're going to try to lubricate with alcohol and it's going to stick a case. Now I'm going to be setting up my sizing die. And one of the most important parts of setting up the sizing die is bumping this shoulder back exactly enough to fit reliably in the chamber of my rifle, but not be so loose that the cartridge can move once the bolt is closed. For a bolt gun, I need to push this shoulder back about 1.5 to 2 thousandths of an inch. That's as far as it needs to go. Some rifles even less. Once again, it depends on your rifle and how easy it is to chamber your rounds. If you're having a little trouble closing the bolt on your finished product, you need to bump them back just a little bit more. On a gas gun, that's going to be more like 3 to 5 thousand to be sure that we can reliably load. So how do I do that? You know, that's the next question. Well, I'm going to use a comparator that I've added to my calipers. And when I'm setting this up, what I want to do is be sure that this base stop here closes and makes even contact with the comparator itself. And that's what these Allen screws are for on the other side, is for me to line that up and snug those down so I can tighten them down each time and they'll line up perfect. So just be sure that you do that or it'll throw your readings off. Then I'm going to just randomly select some cases that I've lubed up and are ready to go, and I'm going to measure them. But what I'm going to do is set my calipers to 0 on one of them, and I'm looking for the longest one, the one that has fire formed the most into my chamber, and that one's just a little less than that one. So far I have the longest one, and I'm looking for one that has a positive number instead of a negative number here. And if it's positive, I'll reset to 0 on it so that I'll have the very longest case that I have. And these are all coming out very, very close to 0 or 5/10 thousandths under. So they're all within 1/1000th, and I have the longest one. So I'm going to set that 1.5 thou back based on that case. How am I going to do that? Well, I'm going to screw my sizing die down, and I'm going to feed a case in there, and I'm going to try to stop just a little short. When I size my case, if I'm not making contact with the shoulder here in my die far enough, that will actually grow. My shoulder will rise as I'm squeezing this case. That brass is going to go somewhere. Well, it's going up. That's why we have to trim cases. Well, it's going to go up and it's going to push that shoulder up. So I'm going to keep turning that down until I get it back to the fired size, and then I'm going to keep going just a little bit farther, 1.5 to 2 thousandths. And let's go ahead and do that. Let's set that up. When I do this, by the way, I want to make sure that I'm fully seated every single time. I want to turn this in a way that while I'm looking at it, I can see that it is fully seated. If I've got a little bit of media from tumbling or any kind of trash, gunpowder, or something falls in there, and it stops that from touching exactly there, I'm going to get a little run out. I'll introduce some run out in the case that I normally would not have. So I want to make sure that doesn't happen. Keep your eye on that as we go. This says it grew. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and run a few more and just double check that, make sure that I get the same result every single time. There we are, 0.002. Exactly right. Let's do another one. All right, I have 3 exactly the same. I'm going to go ahead and run them all. now that my cases are sized, the necks are going to be shrunk too far. So I'm going to use the mandrel in this die to open those necks back up. And if you're wondering, I'm running a 2-2-2-5. And of course my projectiles are 2-2-4. So that's going to give me 1.5 thousandths of quote neck tension. The squeezing effect of the brass is going to be 1.5 thousandths smaller in the neck diameter than the projectile diameter. And I'm wearing a pair of gloves because I'm using a dry moly lube. That's the lubrication that is on this case that's going to allow my mandrel to fit inside there without wearing out the mandrel. I prefer this 21st century version. It has a nice window here so I can see how high my case is going to go into the mandrel, so I don't accidentally screw the die down too far when I'm setting this up, which will cost me a piece of brass, of course, it will destroy it. And I do use this same die with different mandrels for different calibers. So the adjustment does change when I change calibers, which is quite often actually. There's been a discussion about dwell time, whether I should leave these on there for a few seconds, which I had been doing, but I did some research on that and I haven't found any difference at all. So I would say dwell time probably matters in the measurable scientific laboratory way, but not in practical application as far as SDs, velocities, and group size, which is what we really care about. After the mandrel, my next step is going to be case trimming. And the way I'm going to do that, this is using the Lee setup, and by the way, I do have a video on that if you're interested in it. I'm going to trim the case with my trimmer. It's going to index off the tool instead of the case. And then I'm going to chamfer and deburr. And what that means is on bottleneck cases, I don't have an expander. I don't open the bell of that case up like I do on a straight wall or a handgun. So when I go to seat the projectile, which is slightly bigger than the case, if I don't give it a nice chamfered angle, then I'm going to cut into the jacket or the lead of the bullet and strip that out, strip that back as I seat. And then I won't have consistent neck tension and I won't have consistent projectiles. So I need a chamfer. I need to open the mouth up, bevel it, as it were, just a little bit. It doesn't have to be extreme, just enough so that projectile slides into the case and fits snugly without damaging the projectile. That's the point. Well, when I do that, sometimes I get a burr. I get a piece of copper that kind of just hangs off the edge a little bit and makes a rough spot. Well, when I seat that cartridge in my chamber, it's going to hit that burr and not sit perfectly concentric either, just like the case wasn't completely round. So that's what the deburring is. It's just a quick process just to take that off. And I have some steel wool, which actually works very well for that also. I am going to run a deburr on it, and I'm going to run the steel wool. But I'm going to run the steel wool really just because the last time I fired these cases, it wasn't a very hot load, and my necks didn't seal very well, so they're a little bit dirty, and it just bothers me. You don't need that step, but I'm going to use it. Well, I also have that dry lube on the outside of my case, so the first step is actually going to be holding a piece of paper towel here and just cleaning that lube off. Then the second step is I'm going to take a rag. This isn't just a piece of old cotton, a shirt that I've cut up. I'm going to put some alcohol on that and just hold that on there while I rotate, and that's going to take that lanolin lube off there. Lots of debate about whether that's even required, but I would rather get that off than have that inside my chamber, which is where that's going to end up. And I'll have to clean my rifle more often, which I don't much care to do. So I'm going to obviously try to reduce the amount that I've got to clean that rifle simply by doing that. Didn't trim much, probably don't need to trim at all. But just for consistency's sake, I want them all to be exactly the same. I'm going to go ahead and run them through. And you can see that chamfer is catching the light just a little bit. It's a little bit shiny right there. That's all that we need. Don't need much. And you can see I did not take off any material from that outside. I'm not trying to sharpen this into a point. I don't need to remove much material at all from that outside. So primers, I should, out of transparency, note that I have weight sorted these primers. It's probably not going to make much of a difference with 223, but I did want to put that out there, that these are not exactly CCI 400s. They're CCI 400s. They're weight sorted, so they may be a little closer to the bench rest version. Now, the primer seating system that I'm using, I should also, once again, for transparency, show that. But keep in mind, really is not making any difference here either. That's one of the few splurges that you'll see on my channel that really is not necessary at all. My Ammo Master does not have the ability to prime on the press, and I like priming on the press. So I bought this primarily to use on the Ammo Master, and I've really just enjoyed it. So I like using it. I am going to use it today. It does control seating depth, but that is based on the rim. And if there's variance in the rim, obviously there'll be variance in seating depth as well. We always want to seat the primers until they're fully seated so that we don't have any failure to fires because our firing pin is seating the primer the rest of the way. The concept here is using the micrometer, I can adjust that so I get just a little bit of crush on every single primer and they're all the same. But that is dependent on very high quality brass with very uniform rims. I'm using Lapua, which has very uniform rims. Is it at that extreme? I don't know that it is. Once again, completely unnecessary for everything we're doing. It is a very nice tool. I paid for it. They're not reimbursing me for that in any way. But I am going to put a link down in the description for this. I like it. It's a great tool. It is completely unnecessary. With that, if you seat your primers by hand, go ahead and do that. Now, one last thing I'm going to do on this step is really inspect the head of the case. Everything I've done so far, I've looked at the body, I've looked at the shoulders, I've looked at the necks. Really haven't paid a lot of attention to the head and the pocket. And now would be the time to do that as that final inspection, because I'm also inspecting to be sure my primers are fully seated, they're not flush, they're recessed slightly, and they're not upside down. We can still get a flipped primer every once in a while. It happens. That's one of the advantages of having two presses. If that happens, I can throw my universal decap die into one of my other presses and knock it right back out and go right back to priming. The other thing I'd like to point out here is when we seat our primers, we really have one shot at getting a good solid seat. You can see I'm pulling on this press fairly stoutly. I'm not driving it as hard as I would be if I was trying to size the case. And the reason I don't hit it that hard is to set off a primer, I need an upward force against the primer, and I need it to be very fast. That's how a firing pin works, speed and force together. So what I'm doing is just backing off the force a little bit there and slowing it down just a little bit so that I can't accidentally detonate a primer. If it hangs up, doesn't go in the pocket, and I crush it with my press. I have plenty of power here to do that. So where iPro, that's particularly if this is at eye level. If I was doing this on the Ammo Master, it'd be right in line with my eyeballs. That would be bad. So always wear iPro while we're seating. But remember, we only have one shot at getting it fully seated in just a tiny bit of crush, if that's what we're going for here, and that's what I'm doing. So if I stop a little bit short and then try to go back and reseat it, well, the anvil's already formed into that little pocket, and yeah, I'll get it the rest of the way in, but it won't be uniform anymore. It won't be exactly like all the rest. And that's what we're after. Everything we're trying to do is trying to make all of our cases exactly the same, right? As close as we can do within reason. So always seat with the same force, whatever force that is that you choose to use, whatever method you try to use, just make it the same. When setting up my seating die, what I'm going to do is I've got a dummy round with a piece of brass with no primer, no gunpowder, but a seated bullet at my finished dimension that I'm looking for. This is obviously not the very first time you've loaded this that you can use this, but the concept here is just roll your seating die up and then bring it down until it just touches there. If you go a little too far, you will actually seat your dummy around a little bit, so don't do that. And expect that you may have to fine tune that just a little bit. So when we're setting the length of our projectiles, particularly hollow points, the tips themselves can have some variance. So what we tend to do is measure from what we call the ogive, which is where that taper actually starts. It's a very consistent way to do that. I'm going to show you a little bit of an alternative here. I'm running a 20 here instead, and it's not quite coming all the way down to the ogive, but that seats right about where the stem on my seating die is making contact. So I tend to go off of that instead. And what we're looking for is 2.080, and I'm at 7. So the nice thing about having a seating die with a micrometer adjustment, each one of these is going to be 1,000. So I can go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and that should give me exactly 2.80. And that is it on the money. So once we have that set, we'll go ahead and load a couple of these, and we're going to check them. We'll check several to be sure that we have repeatability. And these are Matchmaster, RCBS Matchmaster is the version with this window. I do like the window. I also have a nice redding set that gives me the same level of consistency. Doesn't have the window. I like it a good bit. I recommend either one of them. If you're running a Lee setup or something like that, I also have a Lee, and I use that primarily on my progressive press. It's just a little finicky without the micrometer adjustment. You got to kind of guess a little bit, and we'll just work that down into slow steps. It'll work just fine. Same with seating. I want to use consistent force. Seat these bullets exactly the same way every single time. If I vary that, I will vary the depth by a tiny amount, 1,000th or so. I also want to make sure that my case is fully seated right here as well, or I will introduce some run out. Cartridges are loaded up. We're ready to go to the range for the next video. I hope you learned something along the way in this process. My comment section wide open. If you have questions about what I was doing, why I was doing it, or if you do something different that you think maybe is a better plan, or you're just curious what other people think about it. Everybody watching this video is a reloader, a hand loader. they're going to have some opinions, no question about it. Leave those opinions down below and comment on other people's opinions too. And we can kind of gather a lot more information through a wide audience if we share that way. Second piece, a little housekeeping. I've got a post, and you can click on Old Man Taylor and get to my posts. I got a post in there with the next whiteboard ideas that I have. It only lets me put 4 up there. My whiteboard's a lot longer than that. But these are the 4 that I'm thinking about making next. Go ahead and vote on the one that you would like to see. One of them is 223 load development. Obviously, that's the one I'm working on right now. But go ahead and vote on what you want to see next. And we'll just let the majority pick which topic is our next content. Thank you for watching. Appreciate you hanging in here. If you haven't yet, please hit that subscribe button. Like, comment, all the good stuff. Old Man Taylor, I'll see you next time. Loading cartridges from a spent... Why don't you have anything in your hands? A little housekeeping. If you look at Old Man Taylor, if you go to that and you hit the... That's why there's a little bit of it. Yeah, whatever. That one's 10 thousandths under. That one's 1,000 under.